Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Bee Thiam, your moderator for today's session with Godfrey, a filmmaker and a film critic who has written for New York Times, Film Comment, and Variety. He's one of the early champions of Iranian cinema and a good friend of Abbas Kiarostami. He published in 2019 a book called Conversations with Kiarostami, and it is to date the only book that contains in-depth interviews with Kiarostami. And we are very glad to have with us today, this expert and a close friend, right, of Kiarostami to share with us the cinemas of Abbas Kiarostami. Godfrey?
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Bee Thiam. It's a pleasure to be talking to folks in Singapore. I've never been there. I would love to come there someday, but it's nice to be hosted here by the Asian Film Archive on the occasion of the retrospective of Kiarostami that I know you all are enjoying now. It's been on for some weeks and will continue through August, I believe. I love to talk about Kiarostami because he is, I think, a major figure in world cinema. I think at this point, he's widely regarded as sort of one of the giants up there with people like Renoir and Rossellini and Kurosawa, etc. But when I first encountered his work in 1992, he was just one of a number of Iranian directors that were represented in the first festival of post-revolutionary Iranian films that had been presented in New York, which was presented at Lincoln Center. And I was asked to go to cover this festival by a magazine. And when I went, I had no idea at all that anything was going on in Iranian cinema. So this festival was really a revelation to me. There were just so many good films, so many interesting directors that I was really taken with it. And I went on to sort of make a specialty of Iranian cinema after that because of the enthusiasm that I found in these works. And Kiarostami, I sort of like to tell people sometimes that even though he emerged from this group of directors represented in the festival as the one that got the greatest acclaim worldwide, he was not, head and shoulders above everyone else in this context, because there were so many other really, really interesting filmmakers. And I tend to tell people like that he's not like this solo grand auteur that came out of nowhere. He came out of a very, very active and interesting film scene in Iran. But his films did stand out to me in a way. And the one that jumped out the most and that I ended up writing about first in the article that I wrote was the film Close Up, which is from 1990 and is sometimes described as a pseudo documentary. It mixes fiction and documentary materials in a really interesting, unusual way. But the other things about that film is it's about a young man who is arrested for impersonating a director. The director is Mohsen Makhmalbaf, who was in fact a big director in Iran at the time. And Kiarostami found out about this case, about the young man being arrested for impersonating Makhmalbaf, and went in and started making a film about it. But at the time that film came along, since the mid '80s, when Iranian cinema sort of reemerged following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the impression had been made. There were a lot of films about children, and there was a very humanistic attitude by these films, in these films. And that was sort of the predominant impression that a lot of people had. And there were comparisons made to the films of the Italian neo-realists after World War II. But Close Up introduced some new things to this picture of Iranian cinema. And it had, it showed us some very interesting things about film in Iran and cinema. So it was a kind of a self-reflexive thing that was new. And also it talked about filmmakers and their role in society. And Kiarostami himself is in the film a bit, but Makhmalbaf is in it. And then there's this young man who's arrested who thinks he's a filmmaker or thinks he's an artist and poses as one. So these things were very, very fascinating to me. I had not expected this, or not seen these specific qualities in other films from other places. And so Close Up remained a great film to me, and it really launched me in my whole study of Iranian cinema. I have now been to Iran 7 times to attend festivals and study the cinema, and I did get to know Kiarostami. I got to know a bunch of these directors, but I got to be especially good friends with Kiarostami, and I saw him a lot throughout the 90s and then afterwards. And it was great to know him because I think he was a great man and he was a wonderful person to know. But I also got certain insights, I think, into his work by just being close to him and talking to him at length about things involved with his cinema. He was a very wonderful guy, very warm, and I saw him at festivals all over the world. But I want to sort of introduce, basically my take on his work by saying that after he died, it occurred to me that his work overall broke down into basically three phases, each about 15 years long. The first one starting in 1970, I call the Kanun phase. And Kanun is what Iranians call an organization that's named the Center for the Study of Children and Young Adults. And Kiarostami, there was a government organization that was founded before the revolution and continued after. And Kiarostami was made the head of filmmaking for that as a young filmmaker in 1970. And he started out making films through this organization that, he put it to me, they were films about, but not necessarily for children. And you can see a lot of these films. They're short films, and then there's some short features, and then there's one feature about a child called Traveler that is part of his work in this phase. But anyway, this phase goes for about 15 years, and then what I call his masterworks phase begins with Where is the Friend's House in 1986, and that goes for close to 15 years, and it includes Where's the Friend's House is regarded as the first film of the Coker trilogy, the other two being And Life Goes On and Through the Olive Trees. And those films really, really helped break through and establish him as a world figure. Where's the Friend's House? This film about the little boy looking for his friend's house after school one day won a number of prizes at the Locarno Film Festival, and then that launched him on. And then Close Up, which came after that, got a lot of attention among critics around the world. And then Kiarostami graduated to the Cannes Film Festival, and his next three films were big successes at Cannes. They were And Life Goes On, and then Through the Olive Trees, and then Taste of Cherry, the film that won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and that really represented Kiarostami reaching the peak of renown and acclaim in world cinema. And then that period also contained the film Through the Olive Tree. The Wind Will Carry Us in 1999, which won a big prize at Venice. So that's the masterworks period, what I call the masterworks period. And that's followed by what I call the experimental period. And it's maybe kind of unusual. A lot of filmmakers, when they start out, they're doing kind of experimental work, and then they come into more sort of conventional filmmaking. But Kiarostami, I think, after he had won all this acclaim around the world with the films in the masterworks period that I've mentioned, I think he wanted to just go in other directions and do whatever pleased him, rather than trying to continue on in this way of making a certain type of Iranian art film. And he tried a bunch of different things, and I think it was a very interesting period because he was very, very creative. I think Kiarostami, he wrote a lot of poetry. He did a lot of photography. He was a visual artist. He had a lot of dimensions to his creativity, and I think in this last period, when he was, I think more than anything, just out to please himself, he got into a number of very interesting situations, including making two films outside of Iran, which was unusual for an established director in Iran to do that. But those films, Certified Copy, which was made in Italy, and Like Someone in Love, which was made in Japan, really took a lot of his themes and concerns to other countries. And I think these films are very successful. The first of them, Certified Copy, some critics sort of didn't like so much because I think it wasn't in Iran. I mean, they were used to Kiarostami being so closely identified with Iran that they sort of didn't want to see him go anywhere else. But I think the film is really a great one in on a par with his other great films. And I think the same of Like Someone in Love. But I come back to thinking that Kiarostami is so distinctive as a creator because of basically his honesty and his poetic approach to cinema. This, to me, is the thing that is maybe central to his aesthetic. He, like I say, was a prolific poet, but I think, he told me that he felt like he knew by memory more poetry than any other Iranian filmmaker, and he probably did. I think he knew great volumes of poetry, and of course, Iran has an amazing tradition going back many hundreds of years of great poets. And so I think that when Kiarostami got to filmmaking, there was a lot of influence about poetry in his work, and including the fact that he said at some points he made half-made films. That means that he didn't want to complete everything. He wanted to sort of leave things that the viewer would fill in. And that's a big part of, I think, what makes his films so engaging, is that they don't spell out everything very, very clearly. There are a lot of resonances, poetic resonances that can suggest a lot of different meanings without pinning themselves down to any specific ones. And it's a very rich body of work because of this. I think he put a lot of himself into these films. This is one thing that I think comes from me having got to be close to him personally, is that when I would see his films, I would see aspects of his personality or things that were of concern to him, manifesting in the films. I think that there was a large kind of autobiographical resonance to almost all of his work. And I think it's something that really hasn't been written about or appreciated as much as it could be to this point. But, for example, in the way that these things work poetically, in the film Taste of Cherry, there is a personal dimension in that he said, well, there are a couple of aspects to the personal dimension there, in that it's about a man who is trying to commit suicide, basically. He's going around Iran looking for people who will help bury him after he commits suicide. And Kiarostami said, yes, he had, wrestled with the thought of suicide himself, but he also said that his father at one point was very ill and was wanting to die, and that made Kiarostami think about the issue of, do people have the right to die or not? And of course, that takes you in. That's not only a real personal thing, but it takes you into philosophy and religion too. I mean, really, in this film, you have a seminarian who represents religion, I think, who is arguing against suicide. But then you have an old man who works in a museum, who's kind of a natural philosopher, one might say, who says, yes, there are good reasons not to kill oneself, but ultimately one has the right to do that. So that's where the personal verges into the philosophical, I think. But also, beyond that, there is kind of the political dimension to that, because Iran, as we know, is a theocracy now, has been since its revolution, and that puts religion above philosophy and other concerns. And Kiarostami is making a political point, really, in the way that he sets up this story. So that's one of the things that I like to talk about to people, is the way that the personal and the poetic and the philosophical and the political are all interwoven in very subtle ways. And I think this is something that keeps people coming back to his films, that there are these multi-dimensional patterns of meaning, and also a very distinct aesthetic sense in the way that he films things in a kind of a simple way, but mixing landscapes and faces, and having very sort of precise, painterly visual styles in the way that he works. And so anyway, I think in these three periods that I've outlined, really presents a lot of different things to think about and look at. I'm really happy with this retrospective that you're being lucky enough to see in Singapore now, because it includes all of these periods that I've mentioned. And it's very significant to me because the first period, the period that I call the Kanun period, prior to his world acclaim with Where's the Friend's House and the films that came after, these films have hardly been seen at all up until now. And it is really a very rich period that shows him developing in these little films about children, most of them. And there's some very fascinating creative work in these films. I'll point to one that's a personal favorite of mine. It's a film called A Wedding Suit, and it's about three boys who are having this kind of rivalry over this suit that's supposed to be used for a wedding in a few days, and borrowing it and using it and such. But it's a very clever, interesting film that also works on a lot of levels, but it also shows Kiarostami's skill with young actors, with children, with non-actors. This is something that Iranian cinema became known for, of course, was using real people in these roles, and he intermixes a lot of humor and a lot of suspense in this film, more so than perhaps any other film. So I would encourage you all, if there's that film is still available, to see that film when you have a chance. But it's just one example of the unusual, a little seen until now, films from his first period. But anyway, I'm really glad to be here, as I said, and I'm glad to talk to Bee Thiam now and carry on this discussion.
Yeah. So I think we will spend some time discussing, I think, what Godfrey has just introduced. I also have the great fortune to read Cinema Conversations with Kiarostami, a really fascinating book, I think, for me. As I was following the retrospective, going back, reading this book by Godfrey, it feels almost as if, I am, witnessing a Q&A between him and Kiarostami. So I would like to start with, Kiarostami's films has so many things, right, that you've mentioned, the political, the philosophical, the poetry. But we also know him as someone who was trained in painting. And when I read about your book and realized that he actually spent 13 years in a university studying painting, when other people were only spending about 4 years, I was a bit surprised. Like, why did he spend such a long time, right, in a school environment? Can you maybe share with us?
Well, I never asked him that particular question, but I just, to me, it seemed like very much a part of his personality. He really liked being kind of in sheltered situations where he could just be creative and not have to worry about the outside world and other demands and things going on. That's reflected also in the fact that once he did come out of that and he got this job at Kanun, making these films for children, that was a very sheltered environment too. He didn't have any commercial pressures and such. He was backed by the government, and there were no sort of demands placed on him. As far as I know, he was just free to create in whatever way he wanted to. And I think that was something that was really very valuable and appealing to him. It was really when he came out into the world that he was really challenged to work and had sort of expectations placed upon him. And I think he rose to the occasion in making these great films of the Masterworks period. But then I really think that after where The Wind Will Carry Us in 1999, he had done that. He didn't want to continue climbing that mountain and making a certain type of big Iranian art film. And so he started doing other things, smaller films, digital films, films made in other places. And so he almost returned to the freedom that he had in the Kanun period to be just creative and do whatever he wanted.
Thank you. There was a particular quote that he mentioned about painting that stuck with me. And he was saying that, while he was painting, I think it is a quote from another painter, but I think which he believes in. And he says something like, while painting, if you make a stain on the canvas, you don't throw it out. Instead, you see what suggestions it makes to you, and you turn a weakness into a strength. So I think looking at his early works in Kanun, I find that, I think the way he cut his films, the way he turned something that is supposed to be educational or even pedagogical, right, into works that reveals much more, right, about the society, much more than the children, right, that he was filming. I think it was the biggest revelation for me in the retrospective. So I want to talk in particular to this film that I was really amazed and blown away by, and that's case number 1 and case number 2. Can you perhaps share with us a bit about how it came about and why and the significance of this film, right, in Kiarostami's works?
Yes, I think I agree with you about being blown away by this film. I think it's a really extraordinary film. There I can't think of hardly any other film in world cinema that's like this. A film made during a revolution that's kind of reflecting on the values and the psychology of revolution. The film was made in 1979 when Iran was going through this revolution, and it's about, it's a typical Kiarostami in that it's about children in a classroom situation. But the situation is that the, they have two different scenarios play out of a teacher with students who are being rebellious. And the question is, will other students inform on the ones who are causing the trouble? And so you see two different ways that this plays out. But then intercut with that, you have a lot of grown-up authorities talking about which reactions are the best or the most justified and such. And, some people are saying, yes, these people should tell all these people who are causing trouble, and other people are saying no, they should maintain solidarity. So it all has to do with this psychology of the revolution. And it's funny because the film, after it came out, was given an award by the government, and then it was banned because a lot of the people were saying no, these students shouldn't be. These students should be rebellious. They shouldn't rat on their friends. And then it turns around after the revolution. Of course, the government does expect people to rat on their friends if need be. So it really is fascinating. And as I say, I've never seen another film that's comparable, but it has so much to do with the historical circumstances in which it was made. And I think you have to give Kiarostami credit for being really perceptive and daring in addressing this situation while it was going on, the situation of the revolution.
Did he script the film, or was it done in also a semi kind of documentary way, especially the last part of him having the adults comment on the outcomes?
Well, I think that the film is kind of as it seems, in the sense that he does film this situation in the classroom, which is scripted basically. And then he shows that to these grown-ups and does get their genuine reaction to it. And it's a whole range of people that are, some of whom were sort of famous in the revolution and some of whom were executed afterwards. So those reactions are really fascinating. And that's really what it's documenting, I think, is the way that people are relating to questions like this during the time of the revolution. And it gets those genuine reactions. And none of the reactions of the grown-ups, as far as I know, are scripted. They're all very genuine reactions.
I think one of the other early films that I watch again is, I believe, Brad and Ally, his
Brad
first.
Alley. Yes.
And reading the Q&A, I remembered again that how he spent 30 days
Yes.
shooting this short film, and all
Yes.
because of his dispute with his cinematographer,
right.
who refused to follow his instruction.
That's
and
right.
who doesn't believe in what he was trying to do. And so he just kept going back again and again to shoot it for 30 days. Almost
Yes.
as if like it reminded me of, is that why you spent 13 years studying painting in the university? That persistence that he had, to go after what he was envisioning.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That it was very funny talking to him about that, and he's very funny a lot of times, and just in talking about things. And that film in particular, and the conflict that he had with his cinematographer, I think he had conflicts with other people in his creative teams as he went along. But he made the most of them. Like you talk about the stain and the painting or whatever, he just used that to enrich his creative process. So it is really interesting. But that film, it's funny, that is his first film in 1970, but it lays the groundwork for a lot of what will be in his cinema thereafter. It's a very simple film about a little boy going home after school with a loaf of bread and encountering certain things, and then getting home at the end of the film, 10, 11 minutes. But it really is very much suggestive of many of the things that will follow in his career: the journey, the child, the sort of philosophical ramifications.
So at this point, talking about his early works, can you perhaps share with us, does Kiarostami have any film influence. Because there were some people who compared, I think, what he was doing with the Italian neorealists, or others in the vision.
Yeah, he never sort of really said specifically, yes, I was influenced by this or that. He sort of tried to steer away from that kind of thing. But I think, he did like Italian cinema when he was young, seeing the films of Fellini and others coming to Cinematheques in Iran. I think that those were an influence. There were also influences from within Iranian cinema. There's a great filmmaker who actually never made a feature, but her film, The House is Black. Her name is Farouk Farrokhzad, who's a great, great poet. I think that was an influence on a lot of Iranian filmmakers, including Kiarostami. And there was another filmmaker called Sohrab Shahid Sales, who made a couple of films that were very, distinctive and very sort of had a very quiet visual approach, a kind of a meditative, almost visual style. And I think that was an influence on Kiarostami. But I think he was also just very original. He didn't follow any models that came before.
I think moving on to talk about, I think, his first feature film, The Traveler.
Yes.
When I watched the film, at the end of the film, I think I hear a lot of audience members, sigh in a way, like, why? The tinge of, I think, sadness for the child. But yet I feel that it is not a sad ending, for me at least, that the child has done what he wanted to do, and that he has tried, almost as if it is reflecting, the kind of philosophy and life, right, that Kiarostami believed in. What is your take on that?
Well, it was interesting to me. This is one of the points in the interviews that I did with him in my book that was very striking to me, is when I was talking to him about his first two features, both Traveler and the only other feature that he made prior to the revolution, which was called The Report. And in both of those, they center on characters that are somewhat unpleasant in certain ways, male characters. And in the first film, it's a little boy. In the second film, it's a grown man. And I said to him, are these your way of commenting on certain kind of male, personalities, character in Iranian society? And he said, oh, no, I would never do that. I would never sort of stand outside and criticize somebody else. He basically said these films are more about me. I mean, they're self-critiques, if you will. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And it really gave me a certain perspective on his films being so personal, pretty much all of them. And so that film in Traveler, about a little boy who's trying to get to a soccer match in Tehran and doing all these sort of dodgy things to do that, and then finally getting there and not seeing the match. I think there is a real philosophical underpinning to that is very much Kiarostami, of you have to just pursue, and you have to maybe be unpleasant, and you have to maybe make enemies or whatever. And really, the point is the journey, not the goal. And I think that's an idea that goes through almost all of his work and is very personal to him. I think that's the way that he operated.
Is it the way he, make his films as well? That he will make enemies as well as persist even when he has to, like, get into conflict with his collaborators?
Exactly. Yes. I'm also friends with the cinematographer Mahmoud Kalari, who's like, to me, Iran's greatest cinematographer. And he shot The Wind Will Carry Us for Kiarostami. And he almost said he'd previously sort of avoided working with Kiarostami because they were friends, right? And he thought, oh, well, it could mess up the friendship. But I mean, they got through it. But he told me that it was just not a very pleasant experience because it was not easy to work with Kiarostami. And Kiarostami told me that Kalari was too lazy; he didn't get up early enough. It was very funny talking to both of them about each other, but that's exactly the point you were making, I think.
Yeah, I think looking at his early works, it is a lot about him. I
Yes,
feel, and I'm imagining him as this person who is like, actually, I don't see him as someone who likes to live in his comfort zone, but instead, I feel that within perhaps where he was working, he is really determined and he doesn't give up easily, despite people telling him otherwise,
yes.
to do this and to do that, to follow this way of cutting and shooting.
Hmm.
He has a very clear idea very early on in his filmmaking journey of what he wants. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. He, as I said, he had this freedom in the Kanun situation to do whatever he wanted to do. And he did tell me these films with children are films about, not necessarily for children. If you look at all of them, there are certainly a number of those that don't presuppose a young audience, I think. Then there are others that do. It's a mix of the two. But I was thinking recently about his first four films, which are two short films, Bread and Alley, which we just talked about, and a film called Break Time that comes right after, and it's about the same length. And then those two films, and then the next film is a film called Experience, which is about a young guy coming of age and dealing with life in the city after having come in from the provinces. And that's an hour-long film. And then the one after that is Traveler that we talked about. And all of those films show a very interesting progression in the way that he is dealing with the medium, while all four of them are in black and white, and all four of them have non-actor young actors in there. But you just see this way that he is working out sort of creative problems and themes and such, and it's really interesting to me. Those films form a kind of a nice little quartet, sort of launching his career and showing a lot about what will come afterwards.
I wanted to initially ask you, Kiarostami is known to get very good performances, right,
Yes,
from children.
yes,
So I wanted to ask you about that, and then I saw Homework,
yes,
which is a film. Almost, I feel like I'm almost watching him auditioning children. Of course, the basis of the film is, him interviewing these children and some of the adults as well, what they think of homework,
yes,
the idea of it, and in terms of punishment if they do not hand it up.
yes,
And him interviewing these children, we hear him, we see him, we see his cinematographer as well,
yeah,
whenever it was cut from the children.
right,
And I feel almost as if he's auditioning the whole school, like for a film that he's going to make later. But watching this film, it's so easy to see how he was changing his style. He was changing what he was trying to do because of the kind of reactions that he get from the children. Right, you
yeah,
see that in the first part of the film.
yes,
And then for me, I'm not sure whether I'm imagining it, but towards the last 10, 15 minutes of the film, it feels like he was making a film with some of these children who is perhaps following his instructions to do certain things. Um, and that could be really just, my imagination, because then the kind of interviews that we see changes in terms of the tone.
yes.
Um, can you talk a bit about, how he worked with children? Were you ever on set, right? Seeing how he direct children?
No, I never did. It was interesting to talk to him about all of that, because he had a particular way, I think, of relating to children. He was, I think, very respectful of them, of their individualities and such, and he would sort of find the right one to play the right role based on qualities that they had. In Where's the Friend's House, the main little boy, Kiarostami tells this story about how he chose that boy or found that boy. He was out in this village, the village of Coker, that is, the place where the three of the films that are called the Coker trilogy takes place. And he saw men moving this very heavy thing. And there was this little boy looking at what they were doing with such intent concern that Kiarostami said, that's the face I want for this character, based on this expression on the boys' faces. He watched the thing. So he would, I think, casting was very, very big part of his method of working with children, which was to find a child that had the qualities that he wanted, and then let that child just sort of be themselves in the context of the story in the film. Of course, now we're talking about a fictional film, whereas Homework is a documentary. But I think you see sort of the same thing within the context of documentaries. He is finding certain children that are expressing things that are the things that he's interested in, and then he just lets them be in front of the camera. I mean, he prompts them or he questions them or whatever, but basically it's their actual personalities that he wants to come out. He doesn't really want to shape them. He's chosen them, and he wants them to be as they are when they're in front of the camera.
I think there was also a beautiful account that you have written, which is how he was working with the main child actor in Traveller, with regards to the scene where he has to be caned.
Yes.
You want to share that?
Yes. Well, I thought that was really fascinating, because that scene really struck me when I first saw the film, where you have this man, like, really, it looks like he was really, caning this boy, and it hurts and everything like that. And that was the case. And I said, well, how did you get to do that? He basically said the little boy directed the scene. And when he told the little boy he was going to get certain presents if the scene came off well, so the little boy had a real incentive to say, go ahead and hit me as hard as you can. So that's how it happened. But it was interesting to me that he turned it over to the little boy and let the little boy do it. And I think by that time, the little boy was so into this character, it was, easy for him to do. But that was really interesting. I couldn't, I had to ask that question when I talked to him about the film, because it was something that I was really taken with and surprised by in the film.
Yeah, when I read this account, I feel it's really beautiful, because a lot of the times we hear about filmmakers trying to get actors to tap onto their memories of something that is sad, something that is traumatic, for them to cry, for them to feel a certain kind of emotion. But then when you deal with especially non-professional actors who doesn't know how to protect themselves, right, after the film is over, it feels like it is an act of violence as well, right? And you didn't heal.
Yes.
So when I read about how he was doing it in this way, letting the child know that this is not personal, this is not real, this is a film, this is a play. Right. And this is your motivation. After this, right, you get this reward, which is something that is positive and pleasant and not negative. So I thought the way he deals with it, right, is beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. So do we want to take some questions from the viewers?
Yes. So thank you so much for sharing. And I think we can move on now to the Q&A segment.
Okay.
So please feel free, right, to ask us any questions. Yes, so we have one question here from Elfian. I'm wondering whether Kiarostami ever encountered trouble with the Iranian authorities, like how Panahi experienced, and how he navigated it through censorship minefields.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that applies to all Iranian filmmakers, because the government is overseeing their work, and it's very, very paradoxical situation in Iran. It has been since the revolution. In fact, it was the same before the revolution, just with a different kind of government. Is that the government really sponsors the cinema in the sense that they set it up. They want the films to be made. They want creative films to be made. They want films that will go win prizes and get good renown for Iranian culture around the world. And yet at the same time, they're looking over the filmmakers' shoulders and restricting them in all sorts of ways. And so it is something that I think for Kiarostami, and for others as well, inspires a kind of a poetic approach that is more subtle than people would use if they didn't have these censorship things over them. So he went back and forth with the authorities, and it would to some extent depend on who was in charge at any given moment. There could be more conservative ones that would be more restrictive to him and be harder on him and give him the worst shifts in the editing rooms and restrict his access to this or that. And then the more liberal ones, which would, encourage him and let him go. Kiarostami was not as overtly political as Panahi, for example, or Rasulov. He was more discreet. And I think this really had to do with his personality. I mean, he really, like I said, him being in school for all those years and then being in Kanun for all those years, he liked being protected, and he didn't put himself out there in dramatic ways that could have gotten him into trouble, because he just wanted to go on living his life and doing his work. As far as the reception that he got in Iran, I was there when he was getting to be really famous around the world, and there was a certain amount of jealousy and resentment. And people, a lot of people said to me in Iran, well, why is he getting so much attention and acclaim when there are these other great directors? And I agree that there were these other great directors. And I also think I'm sort of critical of some of the festivals. For example, Cannes in particular, I really got the impression that they just wanted one great Iranian auteur. This was a kind of almost a colonialist mentality, and thinking, oh, here's our Iranian. We've got our Iranian. We don't need a second Iranian. They wouldn't have that kind of attitude toward Italians, for example, or other Europeans or Americans. But because these filmmakers came from this country that was sort of suspect and condescended to by these European authorities, they reacted in that way. But people in Iran didn't really understand that. And I think you have to understand how these festivals operate to get it. And it's not entirely commendable, but it was a situation where he had to just, do his own work, and he benefited from all of this. But it wasn't like he was trying to do these things in order to avoid any kind of political responsibility. And the question does ask about this: did he face criticism regarding his political responsibility? And yes, that is the case. Just as Asghar Farhadi, who has been at Cannes this year, got criticism for not speaking out about what's going on in Iran right now with water shortages and stuff like that. I mean, I personally don't think that it's a filmmaker's responsibility from any country to go on the world stage and make big pronouncements about the politics going on in their country. And Kiarostami didn't either, but he did get criticized for that, especially around the time the certified copy came out, which was after the so-called stolen election of 2009 and the riots and the people being killed. There were certain criticisms of him for not being more explicit in his statements about the regime and these recent events. But he did speak out in certain ways, but he didn't, trumpet it.
But were there any films of his that has actually gotten him into trouble? Because when I was reading your book, you mentioned Taste of Cherry is one that almost didn't make it to Cannes because of the authorities.
Yes.
Were there others?
Well, I think that maybe there were 5 features of his that didn't get released in Iran. I mean, they got made. The government this is something that happened even before the revolution, is that the government would sponsor a film, pay for it, give it permission, and then once it was done, they would ban it. And, like I said, that happened with case number 1, case number 2. They gave it a prize and then they banned it. And he had problems with a bunch of his films, and a number of them have never been shown, had a real theatrical distribution in Iran as a result of that.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Let's see.
When I watched the movie Like Someone in Love, I was surprised how accurately Kiarostami told a Japanese story. Is there any details you can share?
I think that Kiarostami, he had, I think it's very significant that the 2 films he made outside of Iran, these 2 features, Certified Copy and Like Someone in Love, reflected his particular love and affinity for those cultures. He loved Italian culture, and in a lot of different ways, and cinema culture, but also just the whole swath of Italian culture. And with Japan, the same thing. He had a real affinity for Japan, and I think he had enough experience with Japanese culture, Japanese people, and such that he he understood a lot of details, a lot of things about that culture that he could put into this film. I do think the film again has a kind of an autobiographical basis. I think it really has to do with his reflections on getting older and the relationship between men and women and sex in as a person ages. I mean, the character in that was played by an actor who was actually 10 years older than Kiarostami, but it was, I think, Kiarostami reflecting on going toward old age or going into old age. So that's a story that, he may have written and he could have filmed in Iran. Well, he couldn't have filmed in Iran because you couldn't have had this explicit element of this young woman being a prostitute, basically, and that kind of thing. There's no explicit sex, but there's a lot of explicit connotations to what's going on between the two main characters. And so that's why he had to make it outside of Iran. But I think that the essential story could have been made other places. But around that, he builds in a lot of details about Japanese culture that he saw. One story about this film is that, there's a very sort of significant scene in it where the young woman is in a car going out to meet this old man who's going to be her client. And she's been in touch with her grandmother, who's just in town for the day. And the grandmother says, "Look for me in front of the statue," or something like that. And so you see this car going by, and the grandmother is underneath the statue in this kind of square. And they had to look all over because Japanese cities don't have squares like that. And so the place that they were shooting it didn't have any squares like that. So they had to go to some other city to find thing that Kiarostami had in mind. So the thing that Kiarostami had in mind was really something that you might see in European cities or in Iranian cities, town squares with a statue in the center. But it's not very common to Japan. And so he had to sort of impose that idea that he brought into this onto the culture that he was operating in.
Okay, I think we have another question.
This is a good question too. It also allows me to make one observation that, Kiarostami, for all the great acclaim that he got, especially during the Masterworks period in the 90s, his films were never, sort of universally acclaimed by critics. There were many strong Kiarostami partisans, but there were also detractors. And I remember with Taste of Cherry, I was at the Cannes Film Festival when that premiered, is a bunch of critics went across the street after the screening to a hotel to talk about this. And there were some people that really didn't like it, and other people just thought it was this great masterpiece. And so that's something that I think was quality of the reactions that he got throughout his career. I mean, he got established as this great filmmaker, but there were a lot of people questioning his work at the same time. As far as that ending, I think that's really a great question, because the ending was controversial from the first, and I was among those who thought the film would be better without the ending. Now I'm sort of more ambivalent. I mean, I see his reasons for it. I did, recently was in a conversation with several people, including Kiarostami's son Ahmed, and I said, one thought I had in seeing that ending was maybe he felt like he had to put something after this guy is lying in the grave, and he think he may have succeeded in committing suicide, which is a taboo under Islam, and that really was very problematic with Kiarostami getting the film out of Iran. Once it was completed, was this theme, and would the government give their permission for it to go out of the country? But Ahmed said no, that was not the reason that he had this ending, that he had this conception of the film from early on that it would end in a way like that. I mean, it is, I think, reflective of his sort of philosophical position that it's neither life nor death. It is death and life, and so in a way, and life goes on, whatever happens to this guy in the grave, whether he survives or whether he dies, that, we are making a film, and there's life all around the film. So you have the springtime scene with these people, these filmmaking people at the end. I'm more favorably disposed toward it now than I was originally.
Okay, we have one last question.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, Kiarostami loved music, and he was criticized in some cases for using Western music instead of Iranian music in his films. But I think he listened to music, all different kinds of music. He liked jazz. He liked some pop. He loved a lot of Iranian traditional music. And but he was criticized for using Vivaldi in I think it was Through the Olive Trees rather than an Iranian source. But he was just he just went with what he liked and what he thought was appropriate for a film. And he worked with some composers too. Like I think the theme from Traveler is a really beautiful piece of music that he uses again in close-up. So music was something that was very much on his mind in making these films. And as I said, his tastes were very eclectic, and he just went with whatever he felt like. There's also a thing in Through the Olive Trees. The first time I saw that, when it was just new, there was a moment early on where this woman is driving along in her truck. She's the assistant of the filmmaker. And what you hear is a Pink Floyd song over and over again, a little clip that's repeated over and over. And I thought that was really interesting for Kiarostami to have Pink Floyd in the film, but it turned out that they couldn't get the rights to that Pink Floyd material, so they had to take it out. So it's not in Taste of Cherry now, but not in Through the Olive Trees. But every time I see that film, I think about the Pink Floyd music.
Okay, I thought we can wrap up talking perhaps about the legacies of Kiarostami.
Yes.
We hear a lot about how sometimes a film is very Tarkovskian, is very Fellinian,
Yes.
but it is much harder, right? And very rare for people to say, oh, this is a film that reminds them of Kiarostami. Why do you think that is so?
Well, I do hear that occasionally, and I do think that he has been an influence on filmmakers, younger filmmakers, some of whom have talked to me about how much they revere his work. And I think, though, in some of those cases, that he has been an inspiration to do whatever you really want to do and not pay too much attention to the commercial pressures or expectations from critics or different audiences or whatever, rather than any particular aesthetic, characteristics that they've adopted from him. I think there are those as well, but I think it's mainly a kind of an inspiration that he gives people to follow their own path. And I think that's a very healthy thing. And I think it's something that hopefully will continue, that he will continue to inspire people with the way that he worked, as well as, what the products of that work were.
Yeah, I mean, I know many people, right, and many filmmakers, young filmmakers who are inspired, by Kiarostami as well.
Yes.
So, but I feel that, I think it is easy for them to emulate, right, a Tarkovsky or even a Wong Kar-wai, when it was really popular.
Yes.
But very few people are able to emulate, I think, Kiarostami stylistically, right, as well as I think just his whole kind of cinema, which is so difficult to create.
Right.
So, which brings me to we often hear Godard's quote, right, about Kiarostami, that cinema begins with Griffith and ends with Kiarostami. Do you think he's really serious about this?
Well, that's funny. I think I may be somewhat responsible for that quote from Godard, who supposedly said, cinema begins with D.W. Griffith and ends with Kiarostami. I don't know that that's an accurate quote. I've never seen it verified anywhere. I was told it when I was in Iran, I think the first time, an Iranian friend in the film community told me that Godard had said this, and it'd come out somewhere. And so I reported it, and I think that my reporting it got a lot of other people to use that quote. But I have no idea if it's accurate or not. I think it's a kind of a neat idea, and especially if you look at it as the century of cinema, the 20th century. Griffith is the first great one, and Kiarostami is arguably the last one. I had the same idea come to me from a famous art curator recently, who said, in the world of art, Warhol was the last giant. In the world of cinema, Kiarostami was the last giant. And I think if you apply that to just the 20th century, there's a very strong argument to be made for that.
Thank you. So with that, I think we come to the end of this chat. But please take note that the Kiarostami retrospective is still ongoing until 29th of August. And if you're interested to, learn more about the wisdom of Godfrey and Kiarostami and the friendship that they had, do get a copy, right, of Conversations with Kiarostami that's available online. Yep. Thank you so much, Godfrey. And thank
Thank
you
you.
to the Asian Film Archive for hosting us and for mounting the retrospective.
Yes, congratulations to Asian Film Archive, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.